Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer. To access diverse industry data like RCN statistics comprising land area, yield data, RCN production volumes, CFR and farm gate prices, volumes of traded RCN. You can also have kernel statistics such as volumes of raw cashew nuts processed, quantities of kernels traded, and FOB prices. With the premium edition, you can view your chart in so many ways using Excel filters. In addition to this, you also have access to cashew heat and policy maps covering RCN policies in different cashew producing countries, processing policies, and map of African producers and beyond. Get your copy now of the ACA Cashew Barometer.
Selma. I'm the CEO of Ivoirienne de Noix de Cajou. Today, cashews are faceless, and our aim is to give cashews an identity. More than 40% of raw nuts in the world are produced in Ivory Coast, and we believe the cashew identity should be African. So we set up this factory to connect the value chain between the farmers and the consumers. The farmers are fragmented and the consumers are disconnected, and we are here as the processor to connect the two and tell you the story. And this is the story about creating jobs for women and youth in a country that has grown cashews historically but not processed.
Je m'appelle Amani Loukou Charlotte. Mon village c'est Djedou en Ouzé. J'ai 7 enfants. C'est dans la carte là je prends pour faire école de mes enfants.
Problème blue akisi Véronique wakamasika nkranya ba mo ferike mi ya mi nware odike ba nkranya yare itike wakamanye suebo tia ikokranga we gwa kolonsoa mo le flemi e o gedu anze.
Hello, my name is Luis Chito. I am plant manager of EN Cashew. We are focused to make the best quality with the best product, especially for you. We are nuts about cashew.
My name is Ashta Sherif, a quality director at EN Cashew, a BSc certified company in Ivory Coast. My team and I are working every day to ensure a safe product for you and healthy environment for all of our employees.
Thank you very much. And welcome to everyone. I see already the video of Jim is on. Hi, Jim, how are you doing? Can you hear me, Jim? Your microphone is off, I guess. Just checking that you're all set. Hello, Jim? Very good. Hi, Jim, how are you doing?
Good morning, Ernest. How are you doing?
Yeah,
a few
fine,
technical issues here this morning, I'm afraid.
You're talking about your connection?
Few connection issues, but it's okay. We'll keep going. I have a plan B if it doesn't work.
Yeah, okay, hello. If you can all hear me, that's fine. Some slight connection issues here as well. Welcome once again to the Global Markets. Welcome once again to the Global Markets Encounter. And today we have our host, Jim Fitzpatrick, taking us through markets and marketing. So we are looking at the markets, but again, now we begin to look into marketing of the commodity itself. Before Jim takes the floor, I would like to inform you that the session, as usual, is being recorded, and it is coming to you through Facebook Live, also through YouTube and MS Teams for those unable to join through the Zoom. We also have the session in English with simultaneous translation. So on the bottom right corner, there is a place where you can select interpretation and then to choose the language that you want to hear it in. If you want to ask any question, please use the Q&A session. And then during the time for the Q&A, you can also use the raise hand functionality, which is like this, and then we will call you and then allow you to unmute your mic. Again, it's all about networking, so please use the chats to network, get to know each other, and then get to set up your business engagements. Let me also take the opportunity to recognize a few organizations that have made this possible. And here we're talking about ProCashew, SNI, ComCashew, Intersnack Procurement, TechnoServe Benin Cashew, and the Cashew Info. So thank you very much for joining us. And at this stage, I hand over to Jim Fitzpatrick. Welcome once again, Jim Fitzpatrick, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ernest. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're keeping well. I hope you're following this market and enjoying the little bit of activity we've been seeing recently. This morning, we're going to talk obviously about the market. That's what we're here for. And we're going to talk about marketing, and specifically marketing as it relates to African cashew kernels. Some ideas, some thoughts, and some of the pitfalls that processors have experienced in the past. So we'll start by talking about the market, and we're going to break our market discussion into a couple of areas. I'll start off talking about the recent market developments, and then we'll have a look at the crops, the trade, and the overall outlook. It's been a little bit of a quieter week, so there's a little bit less to talk about, but nonetheless interesting. And then we'll talk about marketing African cashews, particularly marketing African cashew kernels. So let's have a look at the market news. Over the past 2 weeks since we've been together, the market's been steady. Prices generally have been steady. Demand has continued good, indeed, maybe very good. It looks to me as if consumers of cashews, including the roasters and the various different segments, are continuing to go through a process of growth, more interest in cashew kernels. And the key factor is that this is not just driven by the conditions of the pandemic. And that's something we need to bear in mind as we look forward to the coming years. Clearly, the buyers are watching this closely, and it's quite a difficult time for everyone involved in the sector to judge exactly where this is going. As we've said previously, a lot of the ingredients are there for a run-up in prices, but there's no real hunger or interest on anyone's part right now to see that happen. The factors that we're seeing in the market at the moment would be very much centered on, in terms of the psychology of the market and the sentiment. People are looking at Vietnam. And if you look at Vietnam, you have to look at Cambodia. So it does appear that the crop is lower. People have stopped talking just about a late crop. They're talking now about a lower crop. In general, if you look locally and talk to people locally in the producing areas, they're a little bit disappointed. They see prices, of course, have fallen back from the start. We started the season 28,000, 29,000 Vietnamese dong, and those prices are now well back closer to 20,000 in some areas. But that may be due to the quality, and it may be due to just a lower quality being available. Clearly, the situation is not fully evolved yet, but there is a problem. If we look in Cambodia, the crop is well on its way. It's almost finished by now. It is a better crop than last year. It's still around the kind of estimates that we spoke about earlier. It's generally, we're going to see a rise in Cambodian production, but probably not to the levels that some people are predicting. I work very closely in Cambodia, and I don't see any reason to believe that some of these big numbers that are being thrown around are anyway close to the truth. If we look at the market for RCN generally, one of the key concerns would be what's happening in India. And there does appear to be some concerns surfacing in India, particularly in certain areas, as to the size of the crop. And India is currently experiencing a surge in COVID-19, and that is impacting a number of the East Coast major cashew producing states. And that too could have an impact, not so much on the size of the crop, but like last year, on how it comes to market and indeed whether it comes to market. But there are now question marks over the situation in India, actually coming from India itself. In West Africa, those very ambitious and very optimistic estimates from early February are pretty much all marked down now to much more realistic levels. The key one is, of course, Côte d'Ivoire, the world's largest producer of cashew nuts. And there it looks like the estimate is closer to 800,000 tonnes than it is to the original estimate of 900,000 tonnes. That's agreed by the trade, and it's agreed generally by the official regulatory bodies too. Elsewhere in West Africa, I think we expect pretty good, normal to good, let's say, crop. Again, we have the phenomenon of, let's say, over-optimistic estimates to begin with, but that doesn't mean that anything's gone wrong with the crop. It just means that the forecasts were a little bit optimistic way back in the early days of February. It seems like a long time ago now. If we look at markets, and particularly if we look at RCN prices across West Africa in the last 2 weeks, we've seen a firming of prices at the farm gate or in local markets. Prices delivered to the ports are up. Generally speaking, the rise at the farm gate has not been reflected by a similar rise in the international offers on a cost and freight basis. Prices have been marked up, but they haven't been as widely supported as the markup in price might suggest. But there is activity at the farm gate. There are all kinds of buyers at the farm gate in West Africa, particularly in Côte d'Ivoire, more than we've seen in recent years. And that naturally is firming up prices. Again, it may well be that the crop is less than expected, and there's no doubt that in northern Côte d'Ivoire the growing conditions were not ideal, but it doesn't mean by any means that we're looking at in any way a disastrous or a failed crop. This is a pretty good crop. It's just lower than the original expectations. If we look at RCN prices more locally, if we look in India, prices are higher than last year, but I don't think last year is a particularly good benchmark for prices. Prices at the farm gate and in local markets in India would still be lower than 2019. What is happening, and it's not surprising, and we spoke about it 2 weeks ago, and we spoke about it way back in mid-February too, is that there are problems of contract emerging, problems of delays in shipments, so-called renegotiation, which is often a warning of contract default. This is happening on cashew kernels, and it's happening to a lesser extent on RCN. This, of course, is a big problem for the industry. This will cause significant damage to buyers' confidence, and this has the potential to interrupt the development of demand, particularly on cashew kernels. And I'll come back to that one a little bit later on. So let's try and put some of this into the context of market price and markets. Let's have a look at RCN markets and market prices. So this is a chart of 4 major origins in West Africa for this season. So starting with the early season, those early season tending to be high-priced speculative offers, people testing the water, maybe looking to speculate a little bit. And this is what we've seen. We've seen prices dip mid-February, mainly in response to the drop in prices in kernels in Vietnam. But thereafter, we've seen prices pick up again. So we calculate, you can see it here in red, we calculate what I call an index. It's more or less a weighted average of pricing of RCN on a cost and freight basis. So this is on the basis of cost and freight India or Vietnam. And you can see where prices are now and where they were at the bottom of the market. We tried to put this into some form of context in terms of the kernels market and context in terms of the history of RCN pricing. And when I look at this, and I think about kernels, I still hear people asking, why have kernels prices not risen by more? And there is a little bit of this situation. Which drives which? Is it RCN driving kernels prices, or is it kernels prices driving RCN? And the answer to that probably lies in the time of year. So you would expect earlier on in the season it would be RCN prices, and later that kernels would take over in driving the market. But looking at RCN, it does beg the question, why have cashew kernels not gone up more in price? So we did a little exercise and we tried to look at the relationship between cashew kernels prices and RCN. So I took, for the various states throughout the year, and the average price based on our index. So that's the index of those 4 major West African origins, taking into account variations in quality, volume, and timing. We looked at the average cost of kernels. We calculated the average cost of kernels based on certain factors. And those factors are about $200 per RCN ton to process. I mean, that is a highly competitive estimate based on Vietnam mainly. Not very many other places could even hope to approach that. So this is quite an aggressive costing, and that is relevant. I used $50 to land and deliver the RCN per ton, and I took an average quality of about 47 pounds. Might be a little bit conservative, and I built into that a 2% processing loss. So I can say that whatever else about this calculation, it is pretty conservative. Now, bear in mind that when we talk about the relationship between kernels and RCN, we can only actually talk about what's going on now. So we relate the price, for example, on the 14th of April for RCN to the price of kernels at the same time. In reality, most of the business for goods being delivered at the moment on kernels was done months ago at different prices in different circumstances. And some of the RCN trade was also done some time ago. Plus, whereas we do have a pretty good idea of what goes on in kernels day to day, in price, in deals, in volumes, the RCN market is much less transparent. It's much more difficult to get an idea of what's going on. So let's have a look at the chart. And on the chart, you'll see 4 lines. 3 of them are labeled. So this is the value per pound FOB of 320s, of WS, or fancy splits, as I prefer to call them, and LPs down at the lower range. So you have a price history for LP, WS, and 320. And you also have this cost. So this line, the red line, relates to these average costs in the table on the right-hand side. So what this says is, if you purchased raw cashew nuts at these prices on these days, and if it cost you $50 to move them to your processing plant, $50 per ton, and if it cost you $200 per ton of RCN to process it, rather aggressive costing nonetheless, and if your average outturn on a cutting test was 47 pounds, and your average processing loss was 2%, giving you around about 25% outturn, without a trading margin for any intermediaries, this would be your cost of product. And as you can see, throughout the season, the cost based on these averages has approached the price of 320s that's been quoted in the market. This gap between the red and the 320 bar is a rough estimate of a margin. And of course, we don't sell all cashews as 320s. We sell a lot as splits, butts, pieces, small pieces, and so on down the line, so that this level of cost is way too high compared to the current level of kernels prices. So for most processors, and here we're talking about highly competitive processors with low cost of processing, but on the other hand, a high cost of supply chain raw material sourcing to move the product to their factories and then to move it back to market, prices have been out of sync all year. Now, the question that we need to ask when we look at this situation, and by the way, this is not unusual, as many of you listening will realize, it's actually, unfortunately, quite a common occurrence in the cashew business. But it begs 2 questions. On the one hand, we can ask, are the prices of kernels too low? And on the other, is the price of RCN too high? It's got to be one or the other. So let's have a look. What we can use in answering that question is the history. So we need to look at where are prices now compared to where they were in the past, both on the RCN and on the cashew kernels. So we take a look. Let's have a look. So here are our 4 line charts again. I've put in 3 major sources of West African RCN, Cote d'Ivoire in blue, Benin in green, and Nigeria in black. And a world average, which is based on the 4 origins that we spoke about earlier. And what we see is that, in actual fact, prices have not been at these levels very often in the last 7 years. In fact, only once in the last 7 years have prices been lower than they are today on RCN. And only once have they been at the same level. So in the last 7 years, as we look at the market, we can see that RCN prices today, compared to history, compared to what's gone on in the past, and we take the recent past because there's no point in looking back 15 or 20 years ago on this particular factor. But on what we see today, RCN prices could not be said to be too high, either in terms of history of the market, in terms of production cost, in terms of on costs and assembly of the product. It doesn't look to me as if we could say fundamentally that RCN prices are too low, or too high indeed. On the other hand, we look at the kernels. And on kernels, this is a much longer chart because on kernels, you can take a much longer period to analyze the progress of the market. And if we look at the kernels market and we look at prices today over here on the right-hand side, where can we find an area where prices were at the same level? And we've got to go back quite a number of years. You've got to go back to 2010 before you can find kernels prices at levels that they hit during last year. And even if we look at today's prices, you've still got to go back all the way to 2000, the end of 2009, early 2010 to see what happened. And if we think about low prices and we think about their impact on the market, we know that price volatility, and we've talked about it many times on this forum and elsewhere, volatility of price is really bad for demand. And again, looking at our kernels price chart, the low prices of 2008, 2010 were followed by a price boom in 2011 onwards. I'm not necessarily saying that that can happen this time, but it is possible. If we look at the period from 2012 through to 2016, we see a relatively stable pattern of prices, a pattern of prices that gave the industry a huge boost. Demand for cashew kernels accelerated at remarkable pace during that period. In Europe, in the United States, in developed markets in particular, but also in India, the biggest consumer, and to a certain extent in Asian markets too. If we look at the impact of this incredible spike in prices during 2016 and 2017, we see demand growth began to slow down. Now, in the last 3 years, I would say we were looking at a period of relatively stable prices before the pandemic. The pandemic came along and gave us this rather illogical drop in price, but we have seen a really remarkable increase in demand. So the message overall is stable prices are good for business. However, when we look at this, we're also saying that at the moment, when we ask this question of how can RCN prices come into sync, or as some people say, come into parity with kernels prices, and we look at the RCN, there's no indication that RCN prices are too high at the moment. mean, and remember, I'm talking here about the whole season. I'm not talking about this minute or tomorrow or next week. I'm talking about over the whole season. There's no indication that prices at the moment on RCN are too high. And if we look at this chart on the screen, there's no indication at all that kernels prices are too low. So what would we expect in those circumstances is an adjustment. And whereas RCN prices would have a limited upside, we can see by this from this chart that the upside for cashew kernels is quite significant. So there is a good possibility, particularly, and I'm not necessarily saying prices are going back to the trend, but if we look at the overall trend over a period of time, indications would seem to suggest that cashew kernels should tend back toward the trend, and that we should see, I would say, this W during the pandemic, we should see that head back toward a continuation of this trend. And that would mean prices probably in a range, let's say 320s in a range, 330 to 340, maybe a little bit outside of that. Now, what would that mean? What do these developments mean? First of all, let's look at the prospect of a lower crop in Vietnam. What does that mean? Well, certainly it means more activity at the farm gate in West Africa, and it certainly means higher prices at the farm gate in West Africa. It probably means a tighter supply of kernels during April, as we're seeing, and probably that extends into May. So tighter supply means probably slower shipments, although we haven't seen that so far, looking at the figures for the exports for Vietnam for March. And the question would be then, could that be a catalyst for a longer term run up in prices? And there's a number of factors that could affect that, and we'll come to those in a minute. What does this mean for Africa? Well, certainly it means that there's competition for the earlier RCN, and we've seen that, and we're still seeing that to a certain extent. Steady farm gate prices. Most people, by the way, if you read the ACA splits from week to week, you can get a good read on where farm gate prices are in West Africa. You can get a good idea of the developments in regulation in that market, and splits is becoming more and more informative. It should also mean more demand for African cashew kernels. If we think of a tight supply in Vietnam in April and May, I know that processors who are ready to sell, particularly to Europeans right now, are making sales, or at least getting the opportunity to make sales, and that there is significant demand. The phones in processing sales offices in West Africa are pretty busy these days, and they're busy with people who are all of a sudden waking up to the fact, wait a minute, is there an alternative supply particularly to Vietnam right now? Positive for Africa to a certain extent. What's not positive for any of us is this phenomenon now of defaults or so-called renegotiation of contracts. What do I mean by this? Essentially, I mean that in a situation where the market has changed, that a seller comes to the buyer and says, I want to change the price on the contract, I want to change the terms on the contract. And in some cases that, unfortunately, more often than not, that is a precursor to a simple default of the contract. Now you may say, and you wouldn't be wrong, you may say, well, why do people buy from processors like that? And the answer is, I don't know. I've done it myself in the past, many years ago. Learned my lessons, I guess. But people are still attracted by low prices in the knowledge that there might be a risk attached to those contracts. That doesn't excuse the practice, by the way, because what happens when we get a widespread default of contract, what happens is the entire industry is put in jeopardy. And that includes the African industry, the Indian, the Brazilian, or the Vietnamese industry. Bear in mind that if you sell to a retailer, or indeed if you sell to a roaster who then sells to a retailer, you must deliver that contract. There is no choice. You lose the business, you lose the client, you probably lose a lot of money if you don't deliver your contracts. So renegotiation doesn't work down the chain, and that's the major fault. You cannot renegotiate down the chain. So when we look at this, what could these defaults and renegotiations cause? Certainly a tightening in the spot market, because people will need to replace shipments and they'll need to replace inventory that's no longer coming from the origin. It could potentially create a chain reaction. So if I have to go into the market today to buy at $3.10 a contract that I originally had at $2.85, I'm probably encouraging someone else to default on someone else somewhere, who then has to come into the market, and then you get this step-by-step effect, escalating prices and damaging the market. That's one effect, and that chain reaction is one of the reasons why the cashew market, when it goes up too much, and when it goes down too much. And we get the market falling out of parity for long periods as a result. Much more fundamentally, much more dangerously, and much more damaging, this can cause a loss of buyer confidence. Now, I'm talking here about kernels buyers, mainly manufacturers, roasters, businesses that must deliver the product they sell based on contracts. If they lose confidence, and this is not a matter of price, you can lose confidence at a low price or a high price. If you lose confidence in the market, again, because it has happened before, that can mean a long-term slowdown in demand. So we are now in something of a remarkable growth phase in the demand for cashew kernels. That can be damaged, halted, even reversed by decisions made on executing contracts, delivering on commitments. And that applies as much to RCN as it does to cashew kernels. So if we think long term, if we're interested in the long term, we should be interested in ensuring that contracts are met, commitments are met, promises are kept. And I see a lot of people now talking about the solution to the difficulty of, for example, sourcing RCN abroad. So in Vietnam, we see people talking a lot about the best thing to do is to add more value. And it's perfectly logical, and it is a good idea, in my opinion. But if you want to add value, you need to honor contracts. Similarly, in India, in West Africa, if we talk about adding value, if we want to talk about selling downstream, if we talk about selling value-added products, if you want to sell downstream, defaults kill that opportunity. If you want to sell value-added products, defaults kill that opportunity. So the simple fact of the matter is, whereas you might get away with a default on a contract of cashew kernels or cashew RCN for a lot of reasons, and there's a lot of history there, and it's been happening for many years. But if you're thinking about roasting, if you're thinking about consumer packs, if you're thinking about food ingredients and value addition, one default is all you get. There is no opportunity thereafter. And indeed, to enter that market, reputation is highly important. If we look at some of the companies, there are great examples of companies like Food Pro, like Tolero in Benin, like the video we just saw, ANC in Cote d'Ivoire, adding value, building reputation. Their reputation is what enables them to add value and make sales downstream, to enter the ingredients market, and perhaps for some of them to enter the consumer packs market. So honoring contracts has a very important role to play in keeping the market organized, keeping the market stable, and in building opportunities for the long term. That's a key factor, and we need to look at that very, very closely. Let's keep looking at what these developments could mean. So if we look at the impact of a lower production in Vietnam, India, and we think about what this could mean for the market. So first of all, we should say that in the major picture, in the big picture of 3.6, 3.7, 3.8 million tons of RCN produced in a year, a crop reduction in Vietnam from 450 to 350 or perhaps possibly 300,000 tons, maybe even less, it's not going to cause a major shortage in the big picture. But if we were to get that combined with a significant problem in India, which we're not sure about, or in Cote d'Ivoire, which we think is unlikely, it could have a big impact on the overall supply and demand situation. Well, what it has done is change the sentiment in the market, the thinking, the psychology, the concern as to where prices are. If we add into this some of those defaults of contract, some of those low price contracts around, I take 285 as, I never understood why people would sell at 285 in terms of sheer business calculation, making a margin, staying in business, thinking long term. But they've done so. And if those contracts are defaulted on, that could cause this chain reaction that I mentioned, which could cause a spiral in prices, which nobody wants to see. So the key things we're looking at now would be the developments in India on the crop and continued developments in West Africa, particularly Cote d'Ivoire, but also elsewhere. There's no real concern, as I said, in West Africa. There are questions in India. These are not acute concerns right now, but something we need to watch. And we're getting a much better picture of Vietnam and Cambodia day by day. So let's have a look at the outlook. Overall, consumption remains strong in almost all markets. Demand is up. US imports are healthy. European imports are healthy. Export shipments from Vietnam are very healthy. We're looking at quite a positive situation on demand. If we look at COVID-19, it's still with us, unfortunately. It seems to be, the biggest question for me is in India right now. A surge in COVID-19 in India, restrictions on movement could have an impact similar to last year on the crop, but also on processing. And elsewhere, slow vaccinations in the European Union may well have a longer term effect too. If we look at the contract defaults, we've talked about this. There is a prospect that this could be the catalyst for a short-term price bubble. If it does, we would have to be concerned about the trend in demand over the long term. On a more positive note, buyers of kernels are certainly looking more to Africa. But the question we really need to ask, and we're going to ask that in a few minutes, is, are African processors ready for this, or are they missing this opportunity? That's demand. Let's have a look at supply side. Lower crop in Vietnam, has changed the market sentiment. No doubt about that. It's not having a big effect on the overall balance. If Ivory Coast does continue to have problems, or if that crop falls below this 800,000 mark or just over that, the supply and demand does shift toward imbalance, and it starts to look like maybe a small deficit starts to emerge. Expecting a tight kernels market until the end of May, with the obvious impact on prices. I think processors, for the time being everywhere, will find margins tight. But to be frank about it, most stakeholders still want this market to remain relatively calm. I mean, if you're a processor in Vietnam, you do not want to be paying big prices for RCN. Similarly, if you're a processor in West Africa or India or anywhere else. Same thing goes for importers, roasters. What most people would like to see is a relatively calm market, possibly with a rising price trend, but not necessarily so. But I think we can expect higher prices in the second half of the year, because don't forget that in the second half of the year, the dynamics change. So I'll take you back to our discussions in February, and we talked about what people want, what creates the sentiment in the market, and what people are looking for. Well, that changes hugely once you go past the middle of the year. So we're now halfway through April. By the time we get into July, you start to get a slightly different view from most stakeholders on the market, at least on the buying side. They don't mind seeing prices rise after that. So we need to look at this very closely. We need to think about the different interests, the sentiment in the market, and the impact that can have on prices, particularly in the second half of the year. So that's a look at markets. I want to talk a little bit now for the second half of this discussion about marketing, and particularly about the marketing of African cashew kernels. As we know, more and more buyers are interested in African cashew kernels. And I asked the question a few minutes ago, are processors ready? Are they missing the opportunity? And what I really want to focus in, do they know how to sell? And I have my doubts. So when I talk to kernels buyers, this is what I hear. They say to me, a lot of them, there are no good processors in Africa. African cashew kernels are more risky. Quality is lower in Africa. Social and environmental responsibility is less in Africa, and African processors do not understand food safety or contracts. In reality, all of these statements are wrong. There are good processors in Africa. African cashew kernels are less risky. Quality is often higher than we would find from Vietnam or from Brazil. Social and environmental responsibility is also likely to be higher in Africa. And many African processors, particularly the new generation of processors built in the last 3 to 5 years, they do understand food safety, and they certainly understand contracts. Question is, these statements may be wrong, but have we as an industry told these buyers anything different? How have we approached marketing? How have we communicated what's going on in African countries on cashews? And there's a number of reasons for this. The first one is what I call the attitude of build and they will come. I'm talking about building a processing plant and hoping the buyers will come. And what happens is that processors tend to neglect marketing. Business plans have machines, managers, money, supply chain, insurance, packaging, but nothing about sales. You often see the case where a new processor waits till the product is ready to even think about selling. And only with the full warehouse do they start to address this issue. Processors don't realize what is needed to become a qualified supplier. Qualified supplier would be someone that has the right product, the right quality, the right approach, packaging, but also has some level of food safety and probably a level of food safety certification. You see situations where owners, proprietors think they can do the sales job themselves as a part-time job. And they often fail in that. They often just don't have the time or they don't have the expertise. And we often see situations where processors are literally paralyzed when products don't sell, especially in brokens. And we've seen that in too many places. So that the issue of selling arises, panic sets in, the warehouse fills up. What do? It's very difficult to get out of that situation, but that's only a symptom of all of the other things. Neglecting marketing, not professionalizing it, and not realizing what's needed to become a professional supplier. So the first thing, my opinion is, the first thing a prospective investor in cashew processing should do is talk to a buyer. Unfortunately, it's often the last thing they do. So linking to buyers, marketing, sales, it's an obvious but sadly neglected task in building a business. And if we look at this and why do export processors fail? This is a question I often ask in coaching of cashew processors. And this is typically the reasons we find. First of all, they underestimate the task. They think it's something you can do with an occasional phone call. They've unclear goals, which is a symptom of the first one. If you don't have clear goals for your sales, it's a factor that emanates from underestimating the task. Poor market research or no market research. Someone who's invested possibly millions of dollars in a cashew processing factory. As the factory goes up, they still don't know who the buyers for this product are. And when they do, they select the wrong customers, which is often the case. So your warehouse starts to fill up. You haven't done your market research. You get a call from someone. I can sell your cashews. Okay, I need to do something about this. Poor customer selection. They leave it too late and they end up with the first person that comes along. They often end up getting exploited in that situation. They don't employ a sales professional. It's often the case that people end up employing a local broker or perhaps a friend, maybe someone who happens to live abroad, who's no contacts, no idea, no understanding of the cashew market. And that's a real issue. And this is what I would say to companies that I'd be working with, that, you know, it's not just about making a deal today. It's not just about solving this problem of 3 containers in the warehouse. It's about the process of becoming an export-oriented enterprise, about building a business that exports. And if you're in any African country right now, your market is an export market. That may change in the future, but today we have to be export. We have to be export-oriented enterprises. We have to deal with marketing. And what can we use? Where are the opportunities in marketing? Well, let's have a look at some of the advantages. For example, this is a comparison of European Union sourcing of cashew kernels, comparing 2009 with 2019. Just draw your attention to the fact, in 2009, Vietnam supplied 47% of the European Union's imports. And it was a much smaller figure than it is today, of course. The rest was mainly India, 35%, and then spread Brazil, and African countries supplied 6%. By 2019, Vietnam was supplying 74%, from 47 to 74%. India had lost its share of the market. India had turned in. The domestic market was booming. Indian processors saw better opportunities domestic, and they chose to go that direction. Africa was still 6%. Last year it was 7%. So it's not really grown. It has grown in volume, of course, because the market's grown, but it's not grown in market share. Similarly for the United States, but even more obvious, in 2009, they purchased 45% of their cashew kernels from Vietnam. That was 86% in 2019, and it was a remarkable 91% last year. So when we look at this from an African processor's point of view, you can admire the fantastic job that Vietnamese exporters have done, or you can see it as an opportunity. Buyers see risk in a high dependence on a single origin. Vietnam. India's turned inward, better opportunities in the domestic market. Brazil, the crop is reduced, processing is reduced, competition is reduced. Can African processors offer an alternative source of supply? It's a powerful argument. It means something to buyers. Interestingly, in the last 12 months, a lot of kernels buyers have come to the conclusion that, look, we do need to support African processors, and now we'll support them with better prices. So it's not unusual now for an African processor to obtain a higher price than might be seen typically on that day from Vietnam. If we look at this opportunity, the opportunity in managing risk we've talked about, and the opportunity in security of supply. First of all, as recent events in the Suez Canal tell us, the closeness to the market is a really important factor. 15 days to Western Europe, 18 days to the east coast of the USA, compared to 38 to 45 days from either India or from Vietnam. So in terms of market accessibility and fast delivery, African processors have a huge advantage. If we look at the fact of being a new origin is actually an advantage in this case. African countries are where most of the world's cashews grow. 55% of the world cashew crop will grow in West Africa in 2021. Buyers are dependent on one origin, as we've seen. They are concerned about unreliable certification from their current suppliers. They're concerned about the uncertain future, related, of course, to this complex, difficult RCN supply chain. So there is an opportunity to talk about security of supply, but I'm not sure that processors are doing that. And we need to look then at what the buyers want. We need to think about what's important for buyers when we think about how we market. And I break it down into a number of areas. Legislative, so we need to meet the law in our destination market. That might be aflatoxin certificates, it might be microbiological certificates, and so on. The product needs to be of the right quality. It needs to be packed in a standard or in an acceptable packaging for the customer. It needs to be competitive pricing. Competitive doesn't mean cheapest. Competitive means within a range, linked to the market, but acceptable to the buyer. You don't have to be cheaper. In fact, sometimes being cheaper is a disadvantage. If you've ever bought any of those branded T-shirts, for example, you pay $60, $70 for a little logo on the T-shirt effectively. So being cheaper isn't always the best way to be, but you do need to be competitive. We've spoken about it a good bit today, reliability and contract fidelity. Keeping your promises effectively is important. Traceability, a big benefit, a very important part of risk management. And finally, quality management systems. So that might be HACCP, it might be an ISO 22000, or it might be, if you're more advanced or longer in business, a BRC or an IFS, something that's within the global food safety requirements. So when we talk to buyers, when we market, we need to bear these things in mind. We need to understand them, and we need to talk to buyers about them, address those issues, involve them in the way we offer solutions. We need to think effectively about how buyers manage risk. People often talk about fear and risk. Fear that something will go wrong, which is often illogical and often causes our market to be volatile when it shouldn't. And the risk, which is a much more fundamental factor. Risk on food safety, risk on suppliers, risk on logistics. And we need to understand those factors as processors, as salespeople, as marketers. We need to understand how the buyers manage risk. So when we look at things like certification, when we look at risk, when we look at how do people express risk? How do people express when they see a supplier as risky? Well, they may, particularly if they're an importer, they may say, well, look, I will buy from you, but only if you'll supply me at a low price. That's how I'm going to manage the risk here. If buyers see risk as high, they look for more certificates, more proof of quality, more audits, more proof of risk management. And the higher they see the risk, the more likely they are to offer difficult or restrictive payment terms. So if I think you're a risk, I might ask you to supply me the product and then I'll pay you once I've approved it. So when we understand what buyers need, then we understand how they manage risk, then we can address that, we can communicate how we operate that. But this is not being done in many African processing companies right now. So we should ask the question, why do some processors make premium prices and others are offered prices even lower than the cheapest price from Vietnam? So if we look at Vietnam today, you could probably buy anywhere from 320s, you could probably buy anywhere from maybe 291 to 315, depending on from whom you're buying, for which position, and your own terms of purchase. And if we look at that, you can see typical, this is an extract from a broker's chart. There's a range of prices depending on the processor, and some of them, this broker in particular breaks them up into A1, A2, B1, B2. Others have other systems. Fact is, there's different prices for different suppliers, different levels of supplier. So that's one of the reasons. Where are you as a processor? Where's your reputation? What certification do you have? How do you communicate with your customer? How well do you know your customer? These are all factors that contribute to the level of price that can be made. So the processor must convince the buyer that the risk is managed and or the risk is low. So this is when I talk about, for example, let's take the idea of corporate responsibility, social environmental responsibility. If there's a perception amongst kernels buyers that behavior in African processing companies is poor, then we need to address that. I actually don't believe it is. I think behavior is quite good. But we don't communicate that very well. So we must talk about the risk. I mean, I've always thought that if we look at African processing businesses, they should aim for as high certification standards as anywhere else. There's no reason why it shouldn't be done. So rather than going for some kind of intermediary food safety certification, set out a plan to reach a high level of certification, maybe over a period of time, maybe with certain investments as you go, and communicate that plan to your customers. So you might say, I haven't got BRC today, but my plan is in 12 months, in 24 months I will have. And this is how I see that developing. And if you support me with business, I can do this. And a lot of that is about customer selection. So if you select a customer that doesn't suit your business, then you will end up being offered low prices. I mean, for example, if you are a large-scale processor with high level of food safety, of good certification, good communication, and you offer to an opportunistic trader, you're going to get a low price. The only conversation is going to be about price. Whereas if you're in that position, maybe you should be talking to a manufacturer, talking about a longer term business, talking about developing a relationship. So are we ready? Do we market? These are the questions that need to be asked. And really, I don't think we're doing it very well. As exporters, as processors, marketing needs to be professionalized. It needs to take, from its very outset, a professional attitude. Even if that knowledge, even if the personnel aren't there, the attitude should be professional. We need to research our customers, understand their needs. And then we need to select the right customer. Communicate with that customer. Tell them what problem we solve for them. Tell them what risk we manage, and tell them why they should do business with us, why they should pay us good prices. And finally, we should keep our promises. So for processors in African countries, it's not just about building a processing plant. It's about developing the right kind of communication and marketing skills and capacity within the business to build that business for the long term. Without it, you can remain a seller of commodities, taking whatever price is offered on the day. With it, you can build long-term relationships, add value to your business, offer security of employment to your staff, and build a reputation that allows the entire sector to move forward. So markets and marketing, thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure as always, and I will hand back to Ernest in case there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick. It's been a pleasure listening to you with the market update, and most importantly also talking about marketing, things that the processor or even the actor in the market should look out for Here, I would like to also emphasize what we talked about, that a prospective processor or investor should talk to a buyer before processing or before coming up with a final product and not at the end. Very often you see people now looking for buyers when actually they should have had some buyer arrangements before the start of the processing. Again, you've talked about what buyers want. There is a question there that I will come to later. But then here you've mentioned the issues of quality, competitive prices, and contract fidelity, which is so key in these days. And finally, you talked about selecting the right buyer or customer, so that you can also have very good relationship built, very good communication built, so that your risks can be known to that buyer or off-taker, and then you can build a long-term relationship in the end. So thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick. Let me say that there are a number of persons who want to ask a question. I want to start with Venkat. So if the technicians can enable the audio for Venkat to ask his question. And then after that, I'll go to Amit, who also has his hand raised. And then there is also in the Q&A questions from Kees Blokland and Stefan Schnack, which I will take once we are done with Venkat. So hello, Venkat. Yeah, before we get Venkat on, let me take the question for Kees, who is asking whether logistics will have an impact on the prices. And he's asking what if the West African RCN will get delays on shipment from the warehouse to Asia. So would you want to take that? Yeah, hello, Venkat.
Hello.
Please speak.
Hi, Venkat here.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good morning, sir. How are you, sir?
Good morning. We are fine. And how about you too?
Fine, sir.
Very good. Please go ahead with your question here.
Sir, my kernel price by and large, it is almost the same. But RCN prices in the last few weeks, it has gone up by $150 to $200. Why is it so? Because there is no change in production figures of West Africa. Only there is some problem with respect to Vietnam. Cambodia also, according to your version, it is slightly higher than last year. Why there is a sudden spurt in price of $150 to $200? So I want to know about that one, when there is no change in the kernel prices. Moreover, in the last few years, processors are not making that much money. What is the incentive for the processors to continue processing if the kernel price moves higher, if the RCN price moves higher?
Did you understand the question? I'm sure, Jim, it's clear. You can take it up. Yeah.
Well, I think that, I mean, to answer the first part of Venkat's question, RCN prices have moved up because the sentiment in the market has changed. I've said it here and I've said it before. I don't think that the actual reduction in supply from Vietnam is going to have a dramatic long-term impact in the supply and demand balance in 2021, but it does influence the way people think about the market. It's probably the case that there hasn't been a great deal of support from processors for the higher prices, except in cases where they're forced to buy to keep factories running. But in general terms, they're not supporting those higher prices. For me, and I think that that was the theme of my market analysis, is that the indication is that kernel's prices are too low. Yes, I agree that there has been difficult times for processors. I personally feel that kernel's prices, particularly in the last 12 months, were much lower than they should have been or could have been. I don't quite understand that. Sometimes I feel that the emphasis on getting RCN prices down is far too much, when in fact the emphasis might be better placed on getting kernels prices up to more workable levels. For now, I think it's probably true that there isn't a great deal of concern about the crop in West Africa, but I do think that concerns have emerged in West Africa in the last few weeks, that the crop, especially in Cote d'Ivoire, is a little bit lower. Don't forget also that this is not always a logical market. So one of the reasons would be, for example, that in general, funding came to the market, cash came to the market a bit later this year, again, probably later than it should have done. And all of a sudden you get a lot of money in the market chasing product. What does that do to prices? It's pretty clear it moves them up. I don't think RCN prices are going to, in any way, they may moderate, but I don't think they're going to crash. They're probably, some of the offered prices today are higher than they should be. But at the same time, the big issue here is, can kernels prices move on a little bit to a more workable level? This time, no, not quite this time, but let's say at February last year, before the pandemic really hit us hard, we were looking at cashew kernels 320s, somewhere around 310 to 320. People readily expected that prices would recover a little bit to 330, 340. My opinion is that that will happen now.
I still see the hand of Venkat coming up. I don't know whether there is. Yes, so if there is some follow-up, you can do it quickly before I move to the next question.
So what is the current? I think the answer is fair enough. The answer is fair enough. Mr. Jim has answered it well. Okay. Now I want to know, how is the COVID scenario in West Africa? Because in India, there are some selected restrictions in some of the major cities because the COVID is slightly picking up. So what about in West Africa, whether the situation is under control? Just I want to know about that.
Yeah, I think, Jim, probably I speak to this one. In West Africa, also the numbers in terms of infections are beginning to pick up. High numbers being reported in some countries. But then the controls have eased largely. So we don't have all those intercity lockdowns that used to be in the past. And business appears to be going normal. There have also been vaccines coming into the different countries. And most people, particularly the aged people above 60 years and the rest, are being vaccinated. And so really everything appears to go back to normal fairly largely in the producing countries in Africa, particularly West Africa. Yeah. So at this point, is that okay, Venkat?
Yeah, okay, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you very much. So now, Jim, there was a question from Keith who wanted to know the impact of logistics on the prices, particularly when you talk of moving West African RCN in terms of all the delays that can occur to Asia.
Hi, Case. Hope you're keeping well. Thanks for the question. I have been talking around the ports, and what I understand is that for example, Abidjan product is ready to go. There is no difficulty on logistics at the moment. There is a little bit of a slowness on shipments, but it's not, at this moment in time, it's not due to logistics. If I look at Cotonou, I see that there are pretty good volumes shipped so far. I think the last number I saw was just under 60,000 tons. So it doesn't appear at this moment in time as if there's a problem on logistics for shipments to Asia from West Africa. Indeed, container lines want to get their containers back to Asia, I think. Elsewhere, look, we'll have to see. I think if we look at Nigeria, there's been difficulties, well, for many years in port capacity, so we can expect those to continue. And as we go on, the next major concern, I suppose, would be Bissau. As far as I know, it's a little early to talk about Bissau, but as far as I know, it'll be the normal, rather difficult situation there. And we did see shipments down significantly last year. I think it was 154,000 tons was shipped, which is obviously well down on a normal shipment year. We'll have to see how that situation goes. But for now, if I have to make a general answer to the question, I'd say there is no major concern at this moment in time that logistics will heavily disrupt the shipment of RCN, but that in some ports shipment is currently slow. But it's not, according to the logistics providers, it's not due to the reasons of either position of containers or availability of vessels.
All right, thank you. We also have Amrit, who had the hand up. Is Amrit there? Before we go to Stefan and then come to Tina. Amrit? Okay, Jim, let's take the question from Stefan Schnack, who wants to know, where would you allocate the need for corporate social responsibility aspects in your slide on what buyers want? Yes.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, of course. I would say this slide is more about the technical aspects. Corporate responsibility is an overriding concern for buyers today. So therefore, you would see that in supply chain management, quality management systems, traceability, preservation of identity, reliability, all of those things would embrace corporate responsibility. So if I could put a diagram that would show that, what I would do is I would put an umbrella over this entire diagram, and it would say corporate responsibility on it. So for me, it's a significant factor that impacts almost every area, because every area has some impact either on the environment or on the society, on the reliability or on the behavior of the business. And if that's a nice way of pointing out that I should have included it, 100% agree. And thank you.
Yeah. Before I go to Tina, who has the hand raised, let me take the second question for Stefan, where he's asking whether African farmers benefit from these rising RCN prices while harvesting is still ongoing. I mean, more or less to take it, who is benefiting from all these increases in prices, particularly during the season? Is it something that farmers gain, or farmers are stuck with a certain level which doesn't get the opportunity to appreciate with any appreciation that you find in the markets along the line here?
Well, it's a good question, because it's not always the case that the farmers are the beneficiaries of rising RCN prices. At the moment, it appears that they are. Farm gate prices in most countries have been rising. They have been reflecting premiums over either the guide price or the minimum price in most countries. So this year, farmers, I would say, are probably benefiting from the higher prices. And it's about time too, because they really suffered badly in each of the last 2 years. Indeed, at the moment, I think probably you could say that even for the export trader, who's often one who makes a healthy margin, business is quite tight. Some of those high margins aren't there that were there in the past. What we've seen is a consolidation in RCN sourcing, especially from Vietnam, and that is having an impact on margins and an impact on the way the market works. So right now, farmers, I would say, are benefiting in 2021 in a way that they haven't done for some time from higher prices. That's not to say that there aren't local or individual abuses. There may well be. It's not to say that in some cases where later payments have been promised that they will actually be made. It's not to say that all farmers are benefiting, but in general, on what we know, and I'm basing this on the reports from the ACA analysts and from some processors I've spoken to, farmers are doing a little bit better from these prices this year. Hopefully, that will encourage them, as we know that the income from cashews is very important for these farmers. And, you know, one of the key issues that we have in the cashew business is the lack of organization amongst producers and growers, and the impact that has on them in terms of their ability to secure a fair price for their products. And there's plenty of examples in other countries of where this works, or other continents indeed, where organizations, bargaining groups, farmer groups can work to support prices. For me, that would be one of the key aspects in making sure that the additional benefit farmers might be receiving in 2021 continues into the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. Alfred also wants to know what the situation will be like in Nigeria. Is there going to be anything like a price crash, especially given the problems at the port, yes, in terms of exporting cargo? Yeah.
Well, definitely, if there's a problem moving cargo, that would eventually have an impact on prices. Recent trends we're told is the prices are firming. Quality is probably a bit better in Nigeria this year than in other years. Prices have been quite steady, but let's be clear: if it doesn't move, it's eventually going to back up. I mean, you could say the same in other countries. You could say the same for Côte d'Ivoire. If the product in the port doesn't move on, eventually that can have an impact on the farm gate. Eventually that can quieten prices and even reduce prices at the farm gate. And in some seasons, and we saw this last year, it can also slow payments and end up to a situation where it's delivery first and payment later. And, again, it's the same in Nigeria as it is elsewhere. Farmers are quite weak. They don't have a voice in the same way other stakeholders have, and they don't have bargaining power or holding power in the way that other stakeholders have.
Yeah, thank you very much. Tina, there is a participant by name Tina. Are you ready to come with your contribution? Hello, Tina. Please enable the audio of Tina for us, the technicians out there. Jim, my next question is going to be on the market prices in context, where you showed some calculations in terms of RCN prices and then the cost per ton. If you can show that slide, Jim.
Yeah. What's the question?
So where we have the yes, so exactly here you are talking only as the scenario for Africa, obviously. And the question is, if you look at what has been presented, it means that African processors will have to process at a minimum about 65% of the high-end grades to be able to reach an average price, or let's say to be able to break even at the price which has been indicated out there as the average price, the line in red. And this can be daunting. What, in your view, can be done, particularly to drive out or to show up the prices or even the uses for the other grades which have obviously a very low price?
Well, first of all, to explain,
yes, yeah.
Just to explain the chart, this is a chart that looks at the export price of West African raw cashew nuts and compares it to the value of cashew kernels on an FOB basis. I've used $200 per ton as a processing cost. So clearly, this is focused on Vietnamese processors, as I mentioned earlier. So what this slide, the story this slide is telling, is that at the current price of RCN and the current price of cashew kernels, Indian, Vietnamese processors, even those who are highly competitive in their cost structures, are struggling to make a margin. And that's been the way, as Venkat pointed out, that's been the way for some time, particularly in India. With relation to broken cashews, well, it doesn't seem that we're going to solve a problem simply by upping the price, even though the price of brokens is showing a slight upward trend in recent weeks, particularly for the higher level grades, fancy butts, splits in that range. This is about really the second subject. It's about marketing. It's about long-term thinking. It's about finding the right applications. So obviously, as a processor, the first thing you must do is absolutely minimize the breakage. That's clear. And that's by making sure that your process is well managed, you have the right types of machinery, and that your staff are well trained. But secondly, that you buy and dry the right kind of raw material. So the first obvious answer to the problem of breakage and brokens and market prices is, insofar as possible, reduce breakage. And there are examples of really good examples of very low levels of breakage in factories in African countries. Secondly, if we're talking about solving the problem of selling broken grades, it's about finding applications and encouraging applications. So I would say one key issue in the sale of brokens and resolving that problem over the long term is price volatility. So would you develop a new product which might cost you, it could cost millions, it could cost tens of millions, but would you develop a new product based on a raw material over which you've no control and which in 2021 could be $1.70 and in 2022 could be $3.70? You definitely wouldn't. You look for ingredients that are relatively stable in price, relatively consistent in quality, and products that address specific technical factors such as foreign matter content, regularity of the size of the pieces, regularity of the coloring, consistency of the grading. So there's a whole range of issues in there in brokens. So it was for many years, outside of India, it was for many years that people would buy brokens in order to just have a slightly cheaper mixed nut or to have a slightly different market segment accessible based on price. There are many, many opportunities now to develop new products. Some of these new products are not selling as much as may be perceived. Cashew butter, cashew milk, these products are not selling as much as sometimes we might be led to believe, or we might actually hope to believe. So we need to address this issue much more fundamentally, and we need to offer these products as food ingredients without the kind of price volatility that we've seen in recent years. It's one thing for a manufacturer of a snack food to somehow deal with volatile prices on 320s, but it's entirely a different matter for a new entrant using cashew nuts as a new ingredient. It's entirely a different matter for them to invest based on the kind of volatility we see in price. So again, price volatility is a very important factor, but also consistency of quality. And a key issue for me on quality would be foreign matter. And this would apply to all cashew origins, where you get high levels of foreign matter, unpredictable foreign matter, issues that need recleaning. I'll give you an example. I know of a company in Europe which makes a cashew paste, and they use that as an ingredient. You would think they would buy small pieces for that. They don't. They buy 320s. They buy 320s and they clean them and they dice them at a huge cost. And the reason is they don't trust pieces for quality, for taste, for foreign matter. So we need to have a fundamental review of how we market, and that applies as much to cashew pieces and brokens as it does to whole grades.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. Now to move on to the issue of defaults and what is beginning to show up, a lot of renegotiations going on. The first question is that, can you talk about the nature of which actor group is where you are observing these defaults? Are they in RCN or is it about kernels? And then most importantly, looking into the future, what is the role of arbitration in resolving this issue? And again, is it possible for an organization like the ACA, or what is the value added actually for, say, ACA institutionalizing the arbitration in this area? Because sometimes we get a lot of requests asking that we serve as arbitrators for between partners, or let's say business entities that have gone into cashew transactions and then are having challenges. But is it something that is worth institutionalizing for cashew, knowing how it works?
Well, I think the first part of the question, we're seeing the signs of so-called renegotiation on kernels more than on RCN, but it's also present in RCN at the moment. So you could say that it's right across the spectrum. I'm not going to mention specific countries or names, but I think most people will know roughly where these problems start. With regards to arbitration is one matter. So you can have an arbitration award, but you have to enforce it. And there are plenty of arbitration facilities available. There are independent arbitrators, there are association arbitrators. Most of the major trade associations have arbitration proceedings attached to them. But enforcing arbitrations is quite difficult, it's quite time consuming, and it's quite expensive. So it's often the case that, unfortunately, enforcing an arbitration may be based on Ghanaian law, for example. Enforcing that arbitration in Vietnam or India or in the Netherlands would be very difficult. So I think that whereas it would be a typical role of a trade association to offer some kind of arbitration service, personally, I wouldn't be recommending it for ACA, let's put it like that, because it's highly complex and it's quite difficult to recruit qualified arbitrators in the sector. No, I think that the way to deal with this problem over time is simply not to tolerate it. And unfortunately, the temptation of low prices. I mean, I said it during the talk earlier. People know what they're getting into at times. I mean, they know they buy from certain people and they realize that the market goes up. They don't get the contract, the market goes down. The contract isn't delivered. So they sometimes know what they're doing, and they sometimes accept that risk. That's not to say that it doesn't cause them big problems. But the fact is that I think that trade associations, regulatory bodies, organizations involved in the sector have a huge role to play in explaining and underlining the impact of this kind of behavior on the market. So it's not just the impact between the two parties to an individual contract. That can have a spin-on effect, and it can undermine the entire market. And at times, and we've seen this in the past. I mean, it's sometimes since we've really seen that kind of deep undermining of the market. But if we go back, you can go back 20 years and you can see essentially people were just getting out of cashews because of this issue. At that time, mostly on cashew kernels. That could return. And it's not, it's, as someone said to me recently, it's kind of an embarrassment to the sector. It shows a lack of a modern professional approach to business. And that discourages new entrants, discourages development. And, we talked about brokens. Why would you get involved in the cashew business as a new entrant with a new product that uses brokens if you suspect that any contract you buy might be undermined by a default? So maybe it's not for ACA, but ACA certainly has a role to play in explaining and encouraging a business culture that is more modern and more professional and more aligned with what buyers need. It might be very well to say, well, look, in my country or in my culture, it's no big deal to default on a contract. But you're selling for export, and you have to behave as export markets need, and you have to think long term. So we're all for ACA, but I don't think set up an arbitration department in the morning, Ernest. Ernest?
There is from Isaac Masusu, a question from Isaac Masusu, who is talking about quality, and I believe he's from Tanzania. And in ACA, we have the ACA seal, which is mainly for the entrance into the processing sector to give them information and knowledge, and also to certify them in a way that they can begin to adhere to food safety standards and the rest. But I see his question going more in the direction of raw cashew nuts, whether there can be a role by ACA to enforce compliance to quality issues in raw cashew nuts. We have also in our institution been looking at whether we should play a role of that nature. So very much like how I wanted your view on the issue of arbitration, what role do you foresee for, say, ACA in enforcing compliance of RCN quality in the different countries?
I don't think ACA can enforce anything anywhere, and I don't think ACA should try to enforce. I think that there are certain quality parameters recommended in some countries. Mostly business is done between two experienced partners who should know the quality that's agreed and have a mechanism to settle any disputes that might arise out of that. I don't believe that it's possible to have a standard RCN quality because it differs from country to country. And there are, of course, certain factors that would be very difficult to quantify. For example, if you look at high quality RCN from Benin, how do you quantify issues like taste, like the preference of buyers in India for Benin origin RCN? In other countries, how would you express, for example, the processing characteristics of Indonesian RCN? How would you express a thin shell or a thick shell, or things that people have learned over years of experience? So I don't think that there is an opportunity to standardize across the world. I think that what we could do is identify certain factors that are important for buyers and sellers, and to publicize how those should be calculated, assessed, and ultimately how they should be rewarded and priced. So, for example, one of the key things that I find missing in many countries is that farmers get the same price regardless of the quality that they produce. And that's often done on the basis of the region. So typically in a certain locality, it's an area that's known for 48 pounds, let's say, just for the sake of the discussion. Someone who produces 50 pounds in that area, if that's possible, still gets the local price. So we don't tend to grade RCN. We don't tend to reward farmers who produce better quality. We tend to commoditize it. And if that were to stop, I think that would be very fruitful in encouraging better practices, and ultimately it would increase yields too. Standardization in one country, regulation of quality in one country makes sense. Attempting to standardize across all of these different countries with different conditions, varieties, climates, I don't think that's possible, and I don't even think it's worthwhile. You might have a situation, you think about it, you could actually get to a situation where you commoditize to an extent where actually prices fall rather than rise. And that would encourage lower quality and not better quality.
On that note, thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick. Before we let you go, we would also want to hear from you what we have for us in the next fortnight when you come the way of participants again with the Global Markets Encounter. So please, you can take that for us now, Jim Fitzpatrick, please.
So in 2 weeks' time, we're going to talk about the markets, of course. And Stefan asked us a question earlier about corporate responsibility, and we're very pleased. We're going to have a guest from the European-based retailer Aldi, who will talk to us about their sourcing strategy and particularly about their corporate responsibility. And I'm looking forward to that. I think that will be highly educational and will help us put a nice context on where corporate responsibility stands in terms of its importance and how African exporters, but also exporters anywhere, can manage that and build relationships with their customers based on that. That's in 2 weeks' time. I think in 2 weeks' time when we come back, we might be looking at a slightly higher market, and we might see more activity. So I'm looking forward to that. Thanks very much, everyone, for your time today. It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Jim, and till we see you again on the 28th of April. Bye-bye. And participants should also note that we will be coming your way next week, Wednesday, with a technical series on processing, which will be hosted by Shakti Pal. And then from the middle of the year onwards, we will also be introducing the quarterly roundtable discussions on policy so that we can also have the policymakers and the people from private sector and development cooperation to bring up the issues to look at the final leg in processing in Africa or in the cashew sector in Africa. What kind of regulatory challenges are there and how we can together work towards improving it. So thank you very much. And see you all next week, 21st, with the technical series on processing, and on the 28th with Jim Fitzpatrick on the Global Markets Encounter, and with him a host, some guests from Aldi, who also, as he said to you, will be talking about issues around corporate social responsibility. Thank you very much, and bye-bye to everyone.
The African Cashew Alliance, ACA, presents the ACA Cashew Technical Series. Join us again as we start sessions on technical issues related to cashews with Shakti Pal. Interesting and interactive topics on cashew processing economics, Burma kernels export from Africa, suppliers' compliance on key market requirements, traceability in cashew processing, food safety compliance, implementation, and the certification process for HACCP and BRC, code of conduct, social and environmental compliance, and many more. Join us next Wednesday, April 21st, for the first session. The time is 9 a.m. GMT. The African Cashew Alliance (ACA) presents the ACA Cashew Technical Series. Join us again as we start sessions on technical issues related to cashews with Shakti Pa. Interesting and interactive topics on cashew processing economics, Burma Kenya's export from Africa, suppliers' compliance on key market requirements, traceability in cashew processing, food safety compliance, implementation, and the certification process for HACCP and BRC, code of conduct, social and environmental compliance, and many more. Join us next Wednesday, April 21st, for the first session. The time is 9 a.m. GMT. The African Cashew Alliance (ACA) presents the ACA Cashew Technical Series. Join us again as we start sessions on technical issues related to cashews with Shakti Pa. Interesting and interactive topics on cashew processing economics, Burma Kenya's export from Africa, suppliers' compliance on key market requirements, traceability in cashew processing, food safety compliance, implementation, and the certification process for HACCP and BRC, code of conduct, social and environmental compliance, and many more. Join us next Wednesday, April 21st, for the first session. The time is 9 a.m. GMT. The African Cashew Alliance (ACA) Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer. To access diverse industry data like RCN statistics comprising land area, yield data, RCN production volumes, CFR and farm gate prices, volumes of traded RCN. You can also have kernel statistics such as volumes of raw cashew nuts processed, quantities of kernels traded, and FOB prices. With the premium edition, you can view your chart in so many ways using Excel filters. In addition to this, you also have access to cashew heat and policy maps covering RCN policies in different cashew producing countries, processing policies, and map of African producers and beyond. Get your copy now of the ACA Cashew Barometer.
I'm Salma. I'm the CEO of Ivoirienne de Noix de Cajou. Today, cashews are faceless, and our aim is to give cashews an identity. More than 40% of